Hello, ladies and gents. Double pawns is on the menu. Wow, my whole face is itching all over. Um, yeah, double pawns. Double pawns. Let's talk double pawns. It is a topic and a problem that I have long been wanting to discuss on this channel because so many times I have this conversation with students at various positions where we start analyzing a move and they go like, no, I don't want that because then I get double pawns. And I'm like, and so what? And then they go like, well, double pawns are meant to be bad, right? And I'm like, I don't know, really? Are they? Says who? And so we have got this mutual puzzlement and confusion where I don't get where they are coming from. They think that their chess coach is a little bit of a loose cannon in this regard. And so I wanted to clarify this whole situation. First and foremost, double pawns are bad is the same completely false statement that originates from the same concept as saying that isolated pawns are bad. No, they're not. There are circumstances when they are bad, but it's like saying that my dark squared bishop is bad. No, it's not. It's totally circumstantial. In situations, and there are many of them, they are bad. Isolated pawns are really bad in a lot of positions, but to make a generic statement that isolated pawns are bad, it's like, no, that's totally wrong. And you can't approach a game with such generalization because inevitably you are going to draw totally wrong conclusions. And the same applies to double pawns. Double pawns are bad per se is just a totally flawed and fundamentally wrong statement, because inevitably, whatever situation you are in, there will be a lot of other factors that impact the position, and you need to incorporate those factors into deciding whether in that particular case your your double pawn is bad or not. But instead of doing the talk, let me walk the walk instead, and I'm going to show you a few examples of what I'm talking about so that we can actually have a bit of an understanding about the dynamics of double pawns. So one of the most popular variations nowadays in the French defense for black is to take on e4 in the d variation, play bishop e7, and when the bishop takes an f6, we take back with the pawn, thus voluntarily taking on a double pawn. By far the most popular and by far the most unpleasant variation to face for white is this very line. Morozevich has made a living out of this. The amount of victories he scored and the amount of easy draws he scored against very high-rated players is quite insane. The concept is very simple. After taking back with the pawn, black has created this very sturdy pawn setup that covers a lot of squares in the center. Additionally, these pawns can move together in unison and defend each other very splendidly, and thus allowing black to challenge the center. And last but not least, of course, the two bishops are operating very nicely, and once these pawns disappear, actually these guys step up as the main features of the position in terms of central control. So there is a lot of venom in having this very sturdy setup, and then they go like, yeah, but what about my king? And every time I hear that, I go like, well, what about your king? Because now if we imagine this king castling here, that means you're castling onto an open g file. And neither of them are typically present in this line because white usually castles this way. And even if they did, probably the chances of an attack going on the g file is not really likely, but it's again highly theoretical because black also tends to castle queenside in this variation a fair bit. Having said that, nothing can really hurt me even if I castle here, because after pawn f5 the dark squared weaknesses are very difficult to exploit in the absence of a dark squared bishop. Let me show you something even better. Let's go into one of the most popular lines in the Nimzo. In the 90s, d5 takes, queen takes, knight f3, queen f5, and black goes, can you please create some double pawns for me? And so they do, and black voluntarily goes into the double pawn scenario and scores remarkably well with this structure. And the reason behind it is very simple. The pawn on f5 is a major pain for white, because now we can never break up with e4, and so these 4 pawns hold up these 4 beautifully and perfectly well. And in fact, the pawn duo on c6 and f5 perfectly covered the white squares on d5 and d4 respectively, so the seemingly more mobile pawn chain for white is actually perfectly rigid and cannot move on. Matter of fact, this motif is so commonplace that we even have this in the Slav, where black, there is a variation where black actually allows white to even take knight for bishop. Can't recall exactly which variation. Let's just go with knight h4 here, and black goes like, yeah, no worries, take me. And again, this pawn covers that, this pawn covers that, this knight can come in from here, this knight can jump in here, and not only is the double pawn not a problem for black, but in fact it's a beautiful springboard for the black pieces to move on from here. Sveshnikov, one of the most popular lines in the Sicilian, features one of the most disgustingly ugly pawn structures in chess history. After g takes f6, for a very long time this position was considered to be absolutely unplayable for black because of the so many positional concessions black has taken. Weak square, double pawns, backward pawn, isolated pawn. The list just goes on and on and on and on, until, among many others, Sveshnikov, a grandmaster from Russia, came along and went, yes, but the fact that we have got double pawns means that we have got access to f5, and then we have got access to f5 again, which means that we can attack the very same square twice. You can never ever do that in chess unless you actually have double pawns. And I'm not promoting the idea of go for double pawns. I'm just listing here the pros against the cons of what you can achieve with double pawns. It's quite commonplace, in fact, in this variation that black plays at one point f5. Actually, it's better to play f5, bishop d3, bishop e6, bishop d3, f5, castles, bishop g7, queen out. This is all theory. c3, 3-4 are both theories. And then black plays f4 and then plays f5 again. And very often there is an idea of taking and then playing f5 as well, which is actually a better way to demonstrate the concept behind being able to play the same move twice, because you can make this pawn disappear and then conquer the square for yourself. So that is a huge benefit for double pawns. And I could show you millions of other variations opening theory where black or white, it doesn't really matter the color, more than willingly undertake a damaged pawn structure because it has benefits. Like very often, in order to have a double pawn structure, the opponent has to give up bishop 4 knight, case in point in front of you. So that's already a plus to us. Secondly, this again is a very sturdy pawn setup that is quite difficult to bite into. It takes a lot of time for white to actually create a weakness here. f5 needs to be played very carefully because, for example, right now f5 is very strongly met by check, bishop in, and all of a sudden that bishop has become the greatest monster on the board. And so this is a very commonly known. Botvinnik already played this structure 70 years ago, and they already knew that this was totally fine to play. I mean, think about it. The Nimzo Indian defense for white, in half of the variations in the Nimzo, are based on double pawns on the c file. In fact, the Zaimish variation goes like, not only do I accept the fact that I might have double pawns, they go like, I'm forcing you to create double pawns because I don't care. It strengthens the center. And once again, I don't want to go on and on and on because the examples of double pawns in opening theory is just endless. Mind you, very similarly to isolated pawns. And so their assessment can't be based on, they are meant to be bad. No, they're not. And as a matter of fact, I claim myself to be educated alongside very traditional and old school chess values and chess books, and so I claim that I have seen a few chess books inside, not only the cover of it. And I can't recall for the life of me at all that I would have read anything in any chess book by any semi-decent author who would have said anywhere, avoid double pawns. Like, whenever I come across it with students, I really get puzzled and to some degree even a little bit frustrated, because I very often find that amateur players, club players, players who would like to become a little bit stronger are lacking incredibly strongly on the chess principle side of their education, which is why I am creating a chess course. By the way, this is commercial for Chessable, about chess principles, because I would really like to reinforce those chess principles of controlling the center, developing correctly, looking after our king, and so on. And they seem to be lacking very strongly here. And then they bring me a chess principle, double pawns are bad, which is not even a principle, and it actually leads their decision making far more powerfully than the other three that I just mentioned there, with center development, the whole stuff. And so I'm like, why is this a thing and where is it coming from? And honestly, I don't know the answer to that. But I would like to show you two examples which are a little bit more practical and really close to my heart, to explain how, what is this position? Oh yeah, how double pawns can play an important role in games. Check this out. We are following here a game played between two really strong grandmasters, Rogozhenko against Morozevich. And we arrive in this position, and I will now make it disappear because I want you to appreciate the beauty of it. Black to move. Do you know what Black played here? Queen f6. He goes, take me. Let's enter an endgame scenario where I have got double pawns. And Morozevich says, it's good for me. Yep, you saw that right. So here we are going against the ultimate double pawn principle, where double pawns are bad, and especially bad in endgames if we are going down that path, which I disagree with. But once again, we should never ever take these principles 100% granted. And he goes like, take me, mate. And the logical explanation why here Queen f6 is actually a fabulous and absolutely awesome move is because double pawns have got one very powerful merit in endgames, among the many downsides, because admittedly there is a lot to them. The merit is that they are excellent at holding up pawn majorities. So if you imagine in your head, remove every single piece from the board here, then white has got a pawn majority here, and black has got a pawn majority here rolling up. And these dudes are rolling up here, correct? And so, obviously, the idea for either side is to create a pass pawn with the majority. Now, you can very easily see that that will be achieved by white by pushing these two dudes up and eventually getting e6 and a pass pawn, and likewise black is going to go up, 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 and up, and there is your pass pawn on c3. Now, incredibly enough, it's a lot harder to picture how to create a pass pawn here for white against this structure. Just try it in your head and see how many pawn moves do you need to make, excuse me, for white compared to the previous scenario to actually score a pass pawn. It's a lot harder. So double pawns are actually surprisingly effective at holding up pawn majorities. Now, they are shockingly bad when they are fixed and they are easily targetable. The reason why Morozevich's idea here is a stroke of a genius is because these pawns are going to display the duty or perform the duty of holding up the majority beautifully well, and white will not have the slightest chance at the same time to actually exploit them as weaknesses, partly because it's easy to place two of them on black against a white squared bishop and a rook combo, which is not very easy for white then to exploit. Look how easily and smoothly Morozevich then converts this endgame from here. Puts the pawn on black, and starts rolling up his majority. Notice instantly how much easier it is for black to roll up the pawns here than for white here. This is the theoretical advantage of queenside pawn majority, which a lot of grandmaster label as a stupid dogma, because then white has got a kingside pawn majority. But I am actually with the larger group who considers queenside pawn majority a slight edge in an endgame, because they are far more mobile and far easier to push and create a pass pawn than these guys here. So c5, bishop back, bishop, they gain some space, brings the boss up like a boss. So the king is now ready to enter the center and keeps rolling the pawns up on the queen's side. Very solid endgame play. And here he actually trades off one of the pawns to enhance the power of the bishop. And now look at what happened actually from the point. It's well worth looking at it. From the point we have scored a double pawn from white's point of view. So let's have a look at it. Oh, okay, awesome. Now their structure is ruined. Let's have a look at who is achieving what in the next 15 moves. So I'm going to look at the position 15 moves later. Here we go. White has achieved absolutely nothing. His pieces are just as passive as they were. The pawn structure on black side is still the same story, although technically f7 is isolated and weak. There is no hope to get to that, and in fact once it progresses to f6, white can forget about ever getting anywhere near to that pawn. And at the same time, the black pawn mass on the queen side is becoming more and more menacing. On top of that, here, by playing rook f3, which is an admittedly very ugly move, he walked into this beautiful tactic that black would just push b5 and it's not capturable because bishop here and mate. Yeah. And so now essentially white is in severe trouble because now there are more and more pawns landing on white in order to try to activate his own pieces, and the pawn mass is just rolling up. And now look at that. It's actually black who is now gaining the upper hand on the king side, because all the white pawns ended on white. Now that had nothing to do with the double pawns, to be fair, but it only goes to show how well black's strategy played off. And yeah, like I said, Morozevich converted the endgame like an absolute boss. That's a beautiful move there. Total domination of the white pieces, and eventually winning the game. After rook f2, f6, we are going to land in a total zugi in a matter of a few more moves. And so white threw in the towel and resigned. A fabulous demonstration of how, on the occasion, we can actually totally overwrite such rules like double pawns to be avoided, because they actually demonstrate immense strength. Another two examples, and then I'm going to cut this story short, that I really like. One of them is totally out there. This one is one of my favorites because I actually do use it myself a fair bit, and I love relying on this motif. So this is a mainline Scheveningen in the Sicilian, and this used to be one of the biggest and most frequently employed variation against a lot of Sicilian setups by white. The Kasparov-Karpov World Championship match featured this line a lot. Even the Kasparov-Anand match featured this a lot. And so there is a motif here where black plays b6, and then at the first given opportunity he plays knight a5, inviting white to take and create double side pawns, which is like next level terrible. And yet I have found 3 games in my database for this position. The reason why it's so few is because queen f2 is not really a good move here, and in none of the games did knight takes a5 take place. One of them was Anand Topalov, another one was Vehibach Vtachnik, which is still a grandmaster game. So it's 2 grandmaster games, and the lesser known player who played this is white. No one even looked at taking on a5, and the reason for that is because these 2 open files provide far more than enough compensation for the damaged pawn structure, because now the black rook is just a monster on that file and plays beautifully. And then later on we can easily play bishop b7, even queen b8 is a common motif here to extend more pressure. A bishop can come to d7, queen b8, rook c8, and all of the black pieces make perfect sense. Or I can tuck the bishop away here, extending the pressure on the long diagonal, and queen b8, rook c8, and all of the black pieces are functioning beautifully well. Fabulous chess. And last but not least, I can't help myself but show you Igor Glek's invention, or at least he's the one who became famous by playing this stuff in the Zamish King's Indian. c5, d5, e6, knight g3, cd, ed, cd. And in this position, there are lots of awesome theoretical moves. a6, a4 is usually squeezed in, and then it's often knight d7, knight e5, often h5, h4, rook e8 gets thrown in. And then Glek went like, I can go knight h5. And amazingly enough, once I play out this move, the engine actually begins to like it a lot for black. Believe it or not, after take stakes, the evaluation of this position that looks shocking at first sight is very near to dead even. And the reason behind this is because after the trade, black gets to play a very easy f5, challenging the white center. Knight e5 is very easy to bring in, and the black queen also has a lot of squares to go to. Look at that. The engine line goes bishop f4, f5, queen d2, queen f6 with a really equalish looking position. Absolutely amazing concept. And again, the dynamic features of the position, the opening diagonals and files, outweigh the consequences of the static problem caused by the double pawns. Breathtaking chess. And so, in conclusion, I would like to say that, usually speaking, double pawns are to be avoided and to be frowned upon. But you have to analyze it in the context of your own game and measure up the pros and cons, because double pawns are bad as a statement is just fundamentally flawed and wrong. And this should never ever be a main principle, the number one rule to fall back onto when making a decision, because there are far more important principles that usually are in play in a game of chess that should impact that decision making. I would say that double pawns would be the fifth or sixth consideration I would look at before adding all of these, ingredients together in deciding whether a certain trade is good or bad for me. I mean, look at that, the good old Trompovsky. Vast majority of players go, yeah, whatever, mate, take me. Double pawns, I don't care. I have two bishops. I've got an easy development. Thank you very much. Even they take back with the G, saying that I don't mind the damaged pawn structure because I have easier access to targeting the center. I've got a semi-open G file, and so on. The list just goes on and on and on. And I'm not saying that double pawns are good, but that is just as bad of an approach to a typical problem that needs to be assessed on a case-to-case basis as saying the opposite, that double pawns are bad. Double pawns are an extremely common feature of chess games, and it's impossible to put them in a box and say it's bad or that it's good. No, you need to assess it on a case-to-case basis, and I very highly recommend you to stir away from just going like, oh, that's double pawns, I don't like it. You can't ever have that mindset, because that is going to limit your thinking and your decision making very, very drastically. It's the same way how I really, really don't like it when students refrain from considering moves, for example, and again, I'm going to bring up the Scheveningen as the ultimate example, and they go and have a look at moves like let's have a look at this main line. And they go g4, and they go like, oh, but that exposes my king. And I'm like, how? Like, this doesn't expose the king in the sense that these guys have no power to get to here. And so whilst, yes, the king's position has become more airy, to claim that this exposes the king is at best a half-true statement, because yes, the king technically is weaker, but the reality is that black has zero chances of exploiting it, and as a matter of fact, it's the black king that is beginning to feel the heat after queen h5, rook f3. And the same applies to double pawns. So what I want you to understand is that you can't once again go like, oh, they are bad, so I didn't do it. No, you have to actually look at the consequences, measure up the pros and cons, and take it from there. So that was my big rant about double pawns. I hope you found it useful, and I highly recommend you that if you think that you are one of those players who are guilty of often making this judgment call without deeper analysis, to try to apply case-to-case thinking and have a look at whether it's really bad or it's actually pretty good for you to have those double pawns. Thank you very much. I will be back with more soon.